Sound speed, camera speed, and action! Welcome to another Create Greg video. My name is Greg, and in today's episode we will talk about ISO, shutter speed and aperture, and how to combine all these parameters together to get the right exposure for video. Greg, you can ask, there's tons of this kind of videos out there. Yes, there's a lot of them where you can learn technical aspects of it. However, I would like to dive into what these parameters mean for video, how to understand the numbers behind the aperture forever, how you calculate it, how you can swap it for ISO to get the right exposure for your video, to understand it once and forever and apply it on a daily basis. Let's dive into it right now. Let's start off by explaining what each of the parameter means. I know you watching that might be on a different level of skills and knowledge about it, but talking briefly about each parameters, ISO is our sensitivity of our camera sensor. Basically, it refers to the sensitivity of the film back in the days. How it works, the lower ISO, the lower the sensitivity of the sensor, the higher ISO, the higher the sensitivity of the sensor. For instance, if you shoot in a dark environment and your video is underexposed, you can increase the ISO to raise the sensitivity of the sensor to capture more light. The drawback of that, the higher the ISO, the more noise and grain you introduce to your video, which most of the time is not desired. Then we've got the shutter speed, which we describe in fraction of the second, like 1/50th, 100th of the second. So if you shoot 24 frames per second, it means we will capture 24 frames per 1 second of the video, and each of the frame we need to expose, and we do that through shutter speed and the length, how long the shutter speed is going to be open. So 1/50th means we will expose it for 1/50th of the second. The longer exposure and the longer we keep the shutter open, the more light we get to our sensor, and the opposite, the shorter we keep our shutter open, the less light we get to our sensor. And the last parameter, called aperture, refers to our lens and actually the mechanism inside called iris, which we can either open or close, and it regulates the amount of light going through the lens to reach the sensor. The lower the number of the aperture, the more open is iris and more light we get to the sensor. The higher the number of the aperture, the smaller the hole and the less light we get to the sensor. It's kind of counterintuitive, but once we dive into the numbers and I will explain how they work, you will understand easily and you will be able to use it without any issues. Okay, once we've got the basics out of the way, now we can talk about the biggest difference between photography and videography. In photography, to achieve the desired result, you can manipulate each of these three parameters. In video, you can manipulate just only two, where one of them is static. What I mean by static, we cannot manipulate shutter speed. We can, but we shouldn't, to follow 180-degree rule. What's the 180-degree rule? Back in the day, someone did the tests and figured out what is the most natural motion blur for movie. And they realized to create that motion blur, they need to control shutter speed in a certain way. So once you've got the film, and here you've got the lens, and between the film and lens, you've got the shutter speed. And for the film camera, the shutter speed looked like a rotating disc. And half of this rotating disc was transparent, emitting light from lens to the film to expose the film. And the disc was rotating all the time. So for half of the time, the film was exposed through the disc. For the other half of the time, the film was closed, namely not exposed through the disc. So you've got the disc now, and half of it is transparent for exposure. Our disc is a circle, which is 360 degrees. And if we expose our film for half of the amount, which means we expose for 180 degrees. And this is where this rule comes from the disc we used to expose the film. Nowadays, we do not have disc in our cameras to expose our digital sensors. To have the same motion blur, we need to follow that rule. And to follow that rule in digital age, we need to double the frame rate of our video. So if you shoot 24 frames per second, 24 multiplied by 2 is 48. So you're supposed to set up your shutter speed to 1/48 of the second, because you do not have this particular number in your setting, in your camera. So you will try to find the closest one, which will be 1/50th of the second. So if you would like to shoot slow motion, 120 frames per second, you will need to multiply that, which is 240. So your shutter speed is supposed to be 1/250th of the second. And this is very important information to know. If you struggle with light, with the amount of light hitting the sensor, and you will go for slow motion, your shutter speed will be quicker, which means you will get even less light to your sensors. You will need to balance that with the higher ISO or open aperture in your lens. Lots of people make that decision to shoot everything in 60 frames per second, and then in post-production decided to either convert it to 24 and use it normally, or use that 60 frames per second for 2.5 times slow motion. And this is where is the caveat. If you shoot in 60 frames per second, your shutter speed is supposed to be set to 125th of the second. When you shoot in 24 frames per second, your shutter speed is 1/50th of the second. So this small distinction, and to keep the motion blur as natural as it's supposed to be, you have to make decision whether you shoot 24 frames per second or 60 frames per second for slow motion before you start shooting video. It's just a small detail, but all the small detail adds up to the final quality of your video. If you want to make better videos, start learning about the details. Yes, you can change shutter speed if you do want to follow 180-degree rule and you would like to have this blurry, dreamy effect. You can have your shutter speed open longer, so you have more motion blur, more things being out of focus because of the blur. And if you want to have this jittery effect, it might be desirable, it might be part of your concept how to shoot the video, but for the most of the time you will be using 180-degree rule. And with that rule, the only things which you can manipulate is your ISO and aperture. Now we arrive to the best part about this video. Let's understand how aperture works, how to use it. Before we dive into that, we need to understand what does one stop of light mean. Is the measure we use to judge the amount of light. Basically, if we increase by one stop of light, it means we will double the amount of light hitting the sensor. If we decrease by one stop of light, we will halve the amount of light hitting the sensor. Once you know this light unit parameter, now we can dive into understanding all the numbers on the aperture. You actually need to remember two numbers, 1 and 1.4. Let's start with the 1 first. So let's assume number 1 equals our aperture fully open and tons of light hitting the sensor. If we double that number, we will achieve 2. And 2 means we decrease the amount of light hitting our sensor by 2 stops. If we double 2, we will get 4. It means we decrease even 2 stops further. Then if we move from 4 to 8, we double 4, which means we decrease by another 2 stops. And from 8 we can go to 16, and from 16 we go to 32, which each increment we decrease the amount of light by 2 stops. And everything would be fine, but we don't want to decrease the amount of light by 2 stops. What if we'll be more precise and decrease by 1 stop? And this is when 1.4 comes in. So between 1 and 1.4, we change by 1 stop. Now let's double 1.4, we will get 2.8. So between the 1 to 1.4, we decrease by 1 stop. Between 1.4 to 2, we decrease by another stop. And then between 2 and 2.8, we decrease further by 1 stop. If we double 2.8, we will get 5.6. If we double that, we will get 11.2, but someone decided to round it to 11. So we've got aperture number 11. If we double that, we've got 22. So now you see the whole range of apertures, starting from 1, 1.4, 2, 2.8, and so forth. And between each of them, we change the amount of light by 1 stop. If we go towards higher number, we are decreasing the amount of light. If you go towards lower number, we increase the amount of light hitting the sensor. Let's grab the lens and show it in practice. So if you look at my Sony G lens 1.8, so 1.8, it means it's as fully open as it can be. But if you see on the markings, I will get the pen to explain that. If you see the markings, so 2 and 2.8, they've got like a more significant mark here, and then you've got the smaller marks here. What it means, between 2 and a 2.8 is 1 stop, but we actually can decrease the amount of light by 1/3 of the stop. So is it 1/3 of the stop, 2/3, 1 full stop. And then we go again, 1/3 of the stop, 2/3, and 1 stop. So between 2 and 2.8, we know is a 1 stop, and between 2 and 4, we know it's a 2 stops. So let's imagine we've got our exposure, everything is set, and we are on aperture number 4. If you would like to increase the amount of light hitting our sensor, we can double that by go to 2.8. If we would like to quadruple that, we will go to 2. The same, if you are here and you would like to reduce the amount of light by half, we can go to 5.6. If you would like to reduce 4 times, we will go to 8. Let's look at the other lens from Sirui, anamorphic one. This one doesn't have such a precise marking, but you've got the main numbers here. So 2.8, it's how wide it can be open. If we move to 4, we change the amount of light by 1 stop to 5.6, another stop, 8, another stop, and to maximum 16. So now in reverse, if you would like to double the amount of light hitting the sensor, we go to 11, it double even further to 8, 5.6, and eventually we will end up to 2.8, which is the widest aperture it can be open. Important things with iris, the more open the iris, the shallow depth of field, which might be desirable to have that cinematic loop. But there is a moment when we would like to have bigger depth of field to have more things in focus. So then what we will do, we will actually need to increase our aperture to reduce depth of field. And then what would happen? We will lose the amount of light to sensor. To balance that, we will have to look into ISO. If you look at our ISO, it's a similar story like with aperture. We can manipulate it by increasing or decreasing in stops of light. When you've got our base ISO set for 500, if you would like to increase sensitivity by 1 stop, you double that amount. So from 500, you go to 1000. So now we double sensitivity of our sensor. If you would like to double further, we go from 1000 to, yes, indeed, 2000. And if you would like to double, so from 2000, we need to go to 4000. And from 4000, we need to double again, and we will go to 8000. So with every time when we double, we increase the amount of stop lights hitting the sensor. Let's get back again If you see, we start from 500 again, so to 1000 we will double by one stop, but what's going on with 640 and 800? This is thirds of the stop. If you have a look at our lens, we've got our full stops and then we've got thirds of the stop. So in that case, we can go for 1/3, 2/3, full stop. 1/3, 2/3, full stop. 1/3, 2/3 and full stop. And this is how is the correlation between them. So let's imagine we set our camera, we check the exposure and it looks like 2.8 aperture and 500 ISO gives us perfect exposure. And let's see, the shallow depth of field is too shallow for our liking. We'd like to increase by increasing aperture by 2 stops to 5.6. Once it's done, we decrease the amount of light hitting the sensor by 2 stops. To balance it with ISO, we need to increase our ISO by 2 stops. So 1/3, 2/3, 1 stop, 1/3, 2/3, 2 stops. So with our new Aperture 5.6, our new ISO will be 2000. And with 2000 and 5.6, we'll get the same exposure as we would set 500 and have 2.8. This is how aperture and ISO works, as simple as that. And this is how we arrive to the end of this too long video. I hope you enjoyed, I hope you learned something. If you did, feel more than welcome to leave a thumbs up, consider subscribing, it would mean a lot to me. But what will be even more important, if something wasn't clear or you believe it was gibberish, let me know down in comments so I can try to explain it again for you to understand so you can apply it and level up your video skills. Until next week.